Does it mean that the card details are read from the chip? Does it mean that the certificate was verified correctly? Does it mean that the transaction was authorized? Nobody really knows. And this particular customer had read some of the reports from Cambridge, so was a bit worried about the security of chip and PIN, and in his letter he questioned the security of chip and PIN. So what the Financial Ombudsman Service said, that although you question the firm's security system, I consider that the audit trail provided is in a format utilised by several major banks and therefore can be relied upon. So this would be like concluding that a document is in XML and hence it's true. In practice, the documents aren't in XML, they're in EBCDIC, based on a format that originated from IBM mainframes and originally formatted for punch cards. But it looks about the same as the previous ones that we've seen, hence the customer is liable. So the customer wasn't really happy about this, so he asked for these logs and for some more information. And what the response was is, although you have requested this information from the firm yourself, and I consider it is not obliged to provide it to you, I conclude that this will not make any difference because the service has already reviewed this information. So he doesn't have the information, he's being judged effectively in a secret court, and he can't pass this information on to anyone who is willing to give it any more scrutiny. Then they go on to say that chip and PIN is secure. As we've already advised you, since the advent of chip and PIN, this service is not aware of any instance where a card with a chip has been successfully cloned by fraudsters so that it could be used for them successfully in a cash machine. Now, this statement is just false. They don't say that they used it in a chip and PIN transaction. They say it's a chip card. I have cloned 2 cards, which are chip and PIN cards, with the permission of the cardholder, I might add, and then used this in a UK ATM. But despite all that, the Ombudsman isn't going to give his money back. My conclusion is therefore that likely that the original card was used to carry out the transactions disputed by you. So that case is currently at court, but it's fairly typical of the response that people get, firstly from the banks and secondly from the Financial Ombudsman Service. And it's very hard to take this further. One of the points that John Gilmore raised in the keynote is that the US justice system makes it comparatively easy for someone to sue someone else. And this has many downsides, but it also has the upside that someone from the US was a victim of a phantom withdrawal. She took the banks to court, and the court ruled that because she was not able to inspect the bank systems, it would have been unreasonable to expect her to prove her own innocence, and hence the burden should be on the banks to prove to the courts that the customer actually made the transaction. And in most cases, US customers do get their money back. In the UK, the situation is very different. In the UK, if you sue a bank and you lose, you pay the bank's legal fees, which will often be in the hundreds of thousands of pounds, and they'll probably take your house off you. So it is extremely difficult to sue banks in the UK. Germany is somewhere in between, where there is a cap on the damages that can be awarded, but it still is very expensive to take on a bank over one of these disputed transactions. So I talked about a number of failures, but now let's talk a little bit about why these sort of things have gone wrong. There's a number of issues. One is that the PIN is not encrypted as it's sent between the PIN entry device and the card. This is a feature of the UK system, although other countries are very similar, and that's because it costs a little bit more money to put public key cryptography onto the smart card so that it can decrypt the PIN if it's sent in encrypted form. But that's not the only issue. There's Also the problem that the circuit board, despite having a tamper mesh, had holes in it that someone can poke a paperclip through and hook onto the I/O line. It might seem a little bit stupid in retrospect that someone's built a system like that, but the engineers who are doing these systems have an extraordinary challenge. There are over 3,000 pages in the specification, and they have to make a device that complies with every one of these and still is cheap and reliable and looks good and all the other constraints that engineers have to do. And these security requirements can't be met by any one module of the chip and pin device. It has to be met as a system property of the whole. So it's probably infeasible, in my opinion, to build a device which protects this line between the smart card and the pin entry device, because it has to be exposed to the rest of the world because someone has to put the smart card there. There's also the issue of economic incentives. The banks certify the devices that the shops can use, and the shops get to select what device from a limited list they can use. But the customer doesn't really get any decision in what type of pin entry devices they have to use in the end. And we can see this effect in the design of the security. The pin entry devices seem to do a reasonable job of protecting the bank secrets, but it doesn't protect the PIN, the customer's identifying number. And also all these devices were certified by either the Visa or Common Criteria specifications. There's a clear violation of the spec. It was meant to cost $25,000. In fact, it cost a cost of a paperclip and a few $100s worth of electronics. And obviously there has been a failure at some stage in this certification. So in order to fix these issues, we need improvements at a number of levels. The PET design could be improved. There could be holes removed from the circuit board, but this is, as I described, an inherently difficult problem to solve. Because there is this exposed contact to the whole world, it's effectively infeasible to protect the information that's being sent across that. So instead, one option is card configuration changes. The card could be configured to support encrypted PIN, and it could also be changed so that there is no longer a verbatim copy of the magstripe stored on the chip. And this feature is called ICVV, which was briefly described in the Newsnight video I showed. What APAC's announced in that program is that ICVV, this new feature where they don't store the full magstripe on the chip, was mandatory as of January 2008. What Jeremy Paxman asked is, just now there are more secure cards being issued in January 2008, shouldn't customers ask for new cards? And Sandra Quinn replied that because the old cards the old cards were just as secure, although there's more security devices on the new types of cards. But in fact, it doesn't make very much difference. I did ask for a new card from my bank, and they sent me one in February 2008, and it still had a full copy of the magstripe on the chip. So even though something was publicly announced as being mandatory, it's still not being applied. And this is common throughout many parts of the UK banking industry. Often things are mandated and then not implemented, but sometimes the mandate is relied upon when a decision is made about whether a customer is liable, and there seems to be nobody, at least nobody in the public community, who's testing the banking system to see whether they really implement all the security features that they're supposed to. There's also the issue of who is liable for frauds. The UK has something called the Banking Code, which is a voluntary code of practice which states that the bank must prove to the customer, in case of any disputed withdrawals, that the customer is liable for this and they have to pay. And that's good on paper. That's what it should look like. But unfortunately, the banks get to choose what evidence they store. And the banks don't have to convince a third party that the customer is liable. They have to convince themselves. And the levels of proof that they require for convincing themselves are fairly low. And because they're able to take this position, there's very little incentive for them to roll out new security measures. Now, this problem has been pointed out by the UK House of Lords. There was an investigation on personal internet security where this question was asked to the banks. They were told that the banking code said that they're liable and they have to prove that the customer made a transaction. So then shouldn't this be enshrined in law rather than being a voluntary code of practice? And the bank said no. So I mentioned that all these devices were certified. The Ingenico was certified under the common criteria, and the Dione was certified under the Visa standards. So the way that common criteria work is that there's a certification body for the country appointed by the government which looks after implementation of common criteria in the country. In the UK, it's called CESG. They're also known as GCHQ. They're the same people who spy on people. In the US, it's a combination of the NSA and NIST, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, I think. So because this was a UK distributed device, we asked CESG about this device and why it still passed certification even though it was clearly flawed. And they replied that they didn't really know, because this was not a common criteria certified device, it was evaluated. And there's a bit of a subtlety here that certified means that there is a public report that's produced on how the device performs, and this report is then sent from an independent testing lab to the certifying body for the country, CESG for example, and they say that this is a good device and it can be certified. What actually happened was that Apax went to one of these testing labs and, the manufacturer of the device chose a testing lab. The testing lab produced a report, it got sent to Apax, and then Apax then said that this looked good and they were then happy to evaluate it. But they're not in any position to certify something. So this is a bit of a subtlety. It's a subtlety that's lost even to the common criteria board themselves, because the list of certified devices is on a web page entitled List of Evaluated Devices. So there is an issue here that consumers are being told that these devices are being certified to an international standard, and they're not. They're effectively being self-certified by the banking industry themselves. We also asked Visa, because they certified both of the devices that we looked at as being secure, and they didn't respond to any of our questions. There is a copy of all the letters that we got on our webpage. The Apax one goes into quite a lot of detail and is worth reading. So there is clearly a failure here in the common criteria certification. So we asked CESG and Apax what they were going to do. CESG said that we need to discuss this with Apax, and Apax said that the responsibility for this is CESG. And as far as we can tell, these devices are still certified and still listed on the Apax website as being evaluated under common criteria and are still in very wide use. There's also the issue of secrecy in certifications. We asked Apax for a copy. They didn't respond to any of our questions. There is a copy of all the letters that we got on our webpage. The Apax one goes into quite a lot of detail and is worth reading. So there is clearly a failure here in the common criteria certification. So we asked CESG and Apax what they were going to do. CSG said that we need to discuss this with APAX, and APAC said that